Hello, my name is Mike Woodruff. Welcome to Beneath the Headlines, where I host a monthly conversation with authors and thought leaders about the ideas shaping our lives. Beneath the Headlines is a production of Lakelight Institute. Today, I'm joined by Professor Abigail Favale, whose work lies at the intersection of Catholic theology, literature, and women's studies. Dr. Favale is a writer, in addition to several books, most recently, The Genesis of Gender, which is what I spoke with her about. She's published in The Atlantic and First Things and other journals. She's also a professor at Notre Dame, where she serves at the McGrath Institute for Church Life. Abigail studied philosophy at George Fox University, and she has both a master's degree in women's writing and gender and a PhD in English literature from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Dr. Favale lives with her husband and their 4 children, and as you will hear today, soon to be in 2 weeks, perhaps by the time this podcast drops, number 5. They live in South Bend, Indiana, and I'm guessing, although I didn't ask, that she roots for the Fighting Irish. In this interview, we discuss the genesis of gender. Here's my interview with Dr. Abigail Favale. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Dr. Abigail Favale, thank you for joining me on Beneath the Headlines. I appreciate you making time for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to start with your story. I know a little bit about it. Your book obviously has got a little bit of memoir in there. You talk about your own life, and you talk about the lives of students and friends and Daisy and other people. And so you tell stories. I'd love to get, especially since your topic, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's delicate. I have crashed a few times. It is full of, it is fluid. It is controversial. And so I think it's just important to be a little bit more personal. So you were a professor with a bit more of a, and I'm not using this in a negative term. I think you described yourself as sort of a progressive feminist. You're a professor in gender studies in a different university. And now you are very much coming at this whole discussion from the vantage point of being a Christian, a Catholic. You are teaching at Notre Dame, and you write a book called The Genesis of Gender, which is previous books that you wrote. One of them at least won an award from a more progressive feminist group. I don't think they're going to give any awards to The Genesis of Gender. So how is it that you have come to write this book?
Oh, yeah. It is a weird story, I suppose. But so I was raised a Christian. I was raised an evangelical Christian and went to a Christian college. And when I was in college, I became really interested in questions about women. And I wasn't getting some very satisfying answers in a lot of my classes. And so I started doing a lot of reading on my own, primarily in feminist theology and feminist biblical criticism. And I just kind of did a cannonball into the deep end, really. I just, as soon as I started studying feminism, I really embraced it pretty wholeheartedly. And so by the time I graduated college and went on to grad school, I was specializing in gender studies and gender theory and women's studies and women's writing. And I'd pretty much stopped practicing Christianity. I was still interested in Christianity intellectually, but I really was not a practicing Christian anymore. To put it maybe too simply, I think feminism had kind of become my religion. And that was pretty much how I was for most of my 20s. And then near the end of my 20s, after becoming a mother and having a kind of escalating spiritual crisis, I experienced a reversion back to Christianity, in this case, the Catholic tradition. And so I went from being, yes, I would say a very progressive feminist professor, specialist in gender studies, to then being a new but devout and serious Catholic, but still interested in the same questions, right? So still interested in the question of gender, still interested in the meaning of woman. And so I began to write about the same issues, but from the vantage point of a Christian worldview. And so when I wrote this book, I actually started out trying to write a book about Christianity and feminism. But then when I got to the chapter on gender, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This was, I think,
Right.
in 2020 when I was actually writing the text. And there was so much going on in the world of gender. And so I thought, well, maybe that needs to be the focus of this book. And so I tried to bring my kind of insider knowledge of that world to help fellow Christians better navigate the pretty significant and swift changes that are happening in our culture in relation to gender, and to also offer a kind of Christian, alternative Christian framing to these questions. So that was sort of... Yeah.
Well, you said about 10 things that I want to ask about, but before we dive into some of the specifics, and I will need you to define the gender paradigm and gender and some of these terms. But I also want to go to some of the I want to go to sort of a flyover of feminist theory and various waves of feminist theory. But I guess I want to hear, as I read your work, having a child was, or I guess it was your second child, was part of your, I think you say at the very beginning, you were having a conversion, two dramatic upheavals in your life: the birth of your second child and a tumultuous conversion, spiritual conversion. So your body was being turned inside out to give birth to a daughter, and your soul was being turned inside out to make room for Christ. So, yeah, say just a little bit more. I mean, so much of what we hear about today seems to be framed more Gnostically, and we're sort of independent of our body, and yet it seems like you're writing as an academic, you're writing as an intellectual, you've got a PhD, you are and you seem to be a little bit of a Renaissance person. You study philosophy, you study social sciences, you're in literature. So you're an academic, and yet it seems like it's a very embodied transition that you have.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think becoming a mother, I converted to Catholicism when my first child, a boy, was about a year old. But I converted with still a lot of my kind of feminist opinions. I hadn't quite changed on them. I was sort of willing to, suspend my disbelief and my doubts, but I hadn't really resolved those questions. And so when my second child, my daughter, was born, that's when I began to really experience more of an internal conversion for about the next year or so. So that was much more of a sense of upheaval, like my worldview being turned inside out. And that particular semester, like the semester I gave birth to her, she was born in February, so it was right in the middle of the semester, I was teaching gender theory. So I was in the middle of teaching this course, and my own kind of conversion, my intellectual conversion, was just in full force, but still not fully complete. So it was a really challenging teaching experience, just teaching these same texts and all of a sudden seeing kind of gaps or tensions or questions. Like I wasn't as satisfied with them as I had been before. And so I was very angsty. It was a very angsty time because I felt like I was teaching this material that I no longer really trusted. And so
talk to me for a second. There's obviously a second person in this marriage, and how are they navigating a whole new worldview?
He was really patient for the ride, but it was really tough. He at the time was an atheist, so we both were raised Christian. We both kind of left the faith, whereas I went more in a kind of postmodern, post-Christian direction. He was much more like a new atheist kind of type. But he was very supportive of me kind of going back to the faith. But it got tricky when it wasn't just about my own individual faith, but it was about how are we going to raise our kids? How is this going to affect our marriage? So it was, there was a period of about, 5 or 6 years where it was really tough. Like, he was as gracious as one could be, but not in the same place at all. Right. So there definitely was this kind of division and tension in our marriage. And he has since also returned to Christianity about 5 years ago. So, but yeah, that was also part of the angst, right? So I felt very alone in this return to Christianity. I mean, most of my friends and colleagues were of the same opinions as I was. And then all of a sudden I was having all these, like, quote unquote heretical thoughts.
Right. Well, that's my next question. Have you been able to maintain friendships with some of your former colleagues for whom you are a bit of a heretic, to use one of your, I think that's the title of one of your chapters.
Yeah, it is. It's the title of the first chapter. Yeah, heretic. Because, I mean, I say it sort of tongue in cheek, because in becoming an Orthodox Christian, I became a progressive heretic. Yeah. Those relationships changed. They didn't become unfriendly. Like, I remained, on good terms with my colleagues, but they were really weirded out. They really did not know what to do with me. And I understand that, it was a pretty radical shift, and it happened quickly. And so yeah, those relationships definitely changed. Yeah. I did have some former students who were much more, I would say, hostile in their kind of disavowal or rejection of me.
Right.
Yeah.
So one more thing, just to sort of set the landscape, level set the room here. I hear about third wave feminism and fourth wave feminism, and I go, wow, I don't really understand this. So my very pedestrian view is that first wave is 19th century or 20th century, late 19th, 20th century. It's about women's rights. It's about the right to vote and own property and other things, leads up to the 19th Amendment. Then you've got second wave feminism, which is a little bit more liberation. It's less legal, maybe more cultural, sexual revolution, some additional women's rights in the workplace, equal pay, some of those kinds of things. Then I get a little bit, and you may need to correct that, but then I get a little bit more like, I'm not really sure I understand third wave feminism or fourth wave feminism. And I don't know if I'm just slow, or people don't agree with each other and terms change meanings. And so I just sort of don't say anything about this.
I think you're right. I don't know if you're slow or not. I haven't known you for that long, but I think it's more the latter. I think once you get past the first and second waves, the metaphor, because feminism is always around after the second wave. It's not like it completely recedes from culture and then comes back. It just starts to morph. And so you can talk about those as waves, these kind of different trends that come through feminism. So second wave, I think your description of first and second wave feminism is really good. And there's a real lull between the two. There's like a good 20-year period between the kind of conclusion of first wave feminism and then the second wave, which comes in the late 60s. And then second wave begins to have a kind of internal fight. I call it the feminist sex wars in the 80s, about things like prostitution and pornography, and whether feminists should embrace those things as potentially liberating for women, or whether they should be seen really as deeply misogynist and sources of oppression. And so that war goes on for a while. And then what comes out of that, I think, is sometimes talked about as third wave feminism, which was much kind of embraced, kind of sexual liberation and quote unquote, like sex positive. Basically anything that you want to do and consent to is great and liberating. And a little bit more of a kind of postmodern flavor. And that I would say happens kind of in the 90s, like 90s kind of punk, like a punk spirit, like slut walks. I don't know if you remember the slut walks from like protesting, things like that. Like that's
Right.
very third wave, I think.
Okay.
And then fourth wave, I think, is a way of talking about how feminism changed, especially in the kind of more online era. And then also an increased interest in intersectionality, in how the question of sexism intersects with other modes of oppression, especially racism. So that's around in the 90s, but it becomes really a key focus, I think, later toward the early 2000s.
And that's like Bell Hooks and Judith Butler and those people.
Yeah. So early Judith Butler, I would say she was a real third waver, and then you have the concept of intersectionality there, like it's, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, I think in the late 80s, but it doesn't become this really kind of central focus of kind of mainstream feminism until I would say kind of the early 2000s. And then by the time you get to the 2010s, that's like almost the central focus. It's really shifted to identity politics.
Right.
You get the Me Too era. And so there's a little more suspicion of things like an attention to the kind of darker side of sexuality, rather than the just sort of let's.
And is it fair to say, because it seems to me at some point about 10 years ago, looking on, that there was more there were more women coming from the left who were suddenly articulating that some of feminism had been against women or had harmed women. Does that start then? Does that start earlier? Is that always a subtext?
Let's see. Well, I think that's a good question. I think, let's see, what year is it? 2025. Okay. So like you're saying like 2015 or something. So I see a significant shift around 2014, 2013. And that is really the shift from, I would say, more feminist questions to very much questions of gender and identity. And so you have these kind of proliferation of these different gender identity labels, which I think is very much driven from online social media. And so you also have this newfound alliance then with kind of popular mainstream feminism and trans issues. So you have kind of trans affirming feminism. So feminists who would say, yes, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. But that caused a huge civil war, really, in feminism, because then you had a pretty large contingent of, yes, leftist feminists who say, hold on a second, a male human being can't just identify to be a woman, right?
Right.
And so,
yeah. So having said all that, you then, you have a book that sort of contrasts a gender paradigm with a Genesis paradigm, a play on your book, The Genesis of Gender. So explain the gender paradigm and explain the Genesis paradigm.
Okay. Well, I do it better in the book than I will off the cuff right here.
Well, then, so my opportunity to plug your book, there you go, right there, Ignatius Press, The Genesis of Gender, a Christian theory. So...
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about these two paradigms, right? A paradigm is sort of a way of seeing reality as a whole. And what I call the gender paradigm is a paradigm where reality is seen as primarily something that we create, right? It's a construct of what humans make and imagine. So if you think about like who's the creator in each of these paradigms, in the Genesis paradigm, there is a creator, right? There's a kind of foundation of existence and truth and reality. And we receive our being from that creator. And even though we as human beings create in certain ways, right, we aren't ultimately the arbiters of truth and the authors of our own existence. But in the gender paradigm, we are. Right? So kind of truth and reality is much more what we define it to be, what we feel it to be, what we believe it to be. So that's a big difference. And then that creates like all these other kind of downstream differences, right? So sexual difference in the Genesis paradigm is something that is envisioned and created by God. It is a gift. It's not something wrong with the world. It's not primarily a source of oppression, even though it's been distorted by sin. In the gender paradigm, sexual difference is either seen as just an outright construct, right? It's this category we impose upon reality, or it's really displaced by, again, the importance of the subjective inner experience. So the importance of the body. The body is much more this kind of blank slate in the gender paradigm. It's this kind of object through which I can express my kind of inner self, my inner consciousness, and I can curate my body to express who I am. But in the Genesis paradigm, our bodies and souls are profoundly united, and so our body is telling the truth about who we are without us having to force it to do so, if that makes sense. So our bodies are a gift, and they're part of what connects us to creation. And there are other differences I talk about in the book, like different views of language, different views of freedom, right? So with the freedom, just briefly, freedom is important, I think, because in the Genesis paradigm, because there is a creator, there is an intentional divine design to reality, including our bodies and who we are. Freedom is about becoming who we were made to be.
Right.
Whereas freedom in the gender paradigm is about becoming who we define ourselves to be.
Right. It seems like, and you bring an interesting background to this, having a degree in philosophy, and the debates about freedom. Is a train most free when it stays on the tracks, or is when it jumps the tracks? And yeah, it seems like there's a lot of confusion out there, and we want to be free from any restraints, but we also want the benefits that come from, I don't know, discipline and restrictions and rules, and yeah, all of that gets lumped together. And let me ask one question, because when I'm in these conversations, especially as it relates more, I guess, to the trans issue, and you sort of are hinting on some of this when you talk about a little bit body and how am I going to understand who I am, who am I, and how does that get worked out in the differences between these two paradigms. What do you say to the intersex challenge?
Yeah, this is I think the most effective rhetorical strategy in this whole debate, because the intersex question is an incredibly complex one, but most people aren't going to take the time to actually wade into it to understand it with any depth. I have a whole chapter on this in the book because I think it's so important. So intersex is often talked about as if it's a synonym for sexual ambiguity. So if someone is intersex, they are neither male nor female, or they're somehow equally both, right? You just can't distinguish between maleness and femaleness in this person. But that's actually not true. So intersex is an imprecise term. It's a canopy term that refers to over a dozen very distinct physiological conditions that somehow affect the sexual development process. So these are physiological conditions. They're about something that's gone wrong with the body or has gone in a surprising direction with the body. And the vast majority of intersex conditions do not result in sexual ambiguity at all, right? So it's more precise to actually talk about intersex men and intersex women, right? Or a man with an intersex condition or a woman with an intersex condition, rather than to talk about intersex as if this is a category beyond sex. It's actually a category that's deeply sexed because it has to do with there are only two developmental pathways of sexual development in human beings. And of course, there are instances where things, do not develop normally. Mm-hmm. That's true of any bodily system, right? But we wouldn't look at a congenital heart defect and then say, oh, well, human beings don't actually have a cardiovascular system that is designed in this particular way, or, someone who's born without a leg, it's no longer accurate to say that humans are bipeds, right? Like we don't use that reasoning when it comes to other congenital conditions, right? So even if there are, in very rare cases, and I'm talking like 0.018% of births, very complex intersex conditions that do result in some kind of sexual ambiguity, that doesn't upend the reality of the sex binary, which is remarkably stable. And our entire species depends upon the existence of that binary.
Indeed.
Yeah. So it's a much more complex question, but like the best way to talk about intersex conditions is actually to be condition specific, because again, there's so much variation among the different conditions. And again, the vast majority of them do not result in sexual ambiguity, but men and women have these experiences. Yeah.
So let me pull us back to a broader topic. Thank you for that. And I knew you had written a chapter, so I knew it was it's come up, and I'm glad for you to share that. So my sense from the cheap seats is that there has been a bit of the pendulum seems to be shifting a little bit in the last, 6 months. And I don't necessarily want to tie that to the election, but it's obviously there's shadows from that. But my sense is that and perhaps it's mostly driven by the trans issue and men in women's locker rooms and some of those challenges in prisons and other things. I guess I'm just curious as to where you think this is going to go. My take is that there seems to be this resurgence of a more traditional ethic among some of the younger people, especially men. I have a friend who's got a child at Boston College, so Catholic school, and he was saying that a bunch of the young students are now very conservative. They're wearing suits to class. They want Mass in Latin, and the big scandal was that they were sneaking priests in the middle of the night to go into the chapel and have Mass in Latin, which of course was against what Francis wanted. Who knows what Leo's going to say? But this was an odd form of rebellion. You now have a three-piece suit wearing 19-year-old who is also likely to be married, and these professors are like, they don't know what to do with these students. So you've got some of that, and I've not seen statistics that lead me to believe this is a groundswell. It's more anecdotal information, but I do hear that, and at the same time, I'm guessing that this is not that the gender studies departments are not changing their views, and perhaps just the gulf is getting bigger. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think you're right. So I think there's definitely been, a vibe shift, I guess this is what people talk about it, in the sense that I think what, I've been calling the gender paradigm does not hold the kind of social capital that it did 5 years ago, 3 years ago, even. So there has been a pushback, I think, from especially just normie Americans on some of these claims. I think a lot of it's been sparked by sports, honestly, because we care about sports here in America. And the optics,
most people only know about colleges what they read on the sports page. That's where you read about colleges.
And the optics in sports are so clear because, athletics depends so much on the structure of our bodies. And so it becomes undeniable that there are real differences when you look at sports. So I think now what's interesting, especially when thinking about what we should do as churches and Christians, I think we need to shift and think about, while not giving up on the kind of formational question here, like we need to have good theology of gender. So we need to keep that up. But I think we also need to make sure that we don't just ride this kind of cultural shift into a place of looking down upon and sort of gloating, I guess, about people who are still kind of wrestling with and in the gender paradigm, but to rather see those as opportunities of evangelization. So I think there's definitely been a cultural shift, but there are still people who are wrestling with gender. There are still people who identify as trans, and we need to not make them into like political enemies and to see them as walking ideologies, but to see them as like, yeah.
That sort of perfectly sets up my next question for you, and that is, what do you say, or how do you set about lovingly trying to persuade your friends, your former colleagues, your students, former students, those people who identify as trans, whoever you're talking to. So you're a philosopher and a social scientist, and you have made this embodied transition as a mom. What are you talking to them about that? Are you talking to them about the good, the true, the beautiful? I mean, what are you saying to them? And then the next question I'm going to ask is, what do you say to me? So I'm a pastor. I'm an evangelical pastor. So I want to give you a chance to. I don't necessarily want to say shoot at both sides, but I'm going to give you a chance to persuade both sides. What would you say, first of all, to your former colleagues, your former self, maybe?
Yeah. Well, I feel like everything I write is sort of to my former self. Like I think about that a lot. I'm like, what would I think about this? Like, how would I try to reach? I mean, when I think about it depends upon the context, but first and foremost, I think it's about connecting with someone as a human being and not seeing, you have to kind of see past the labels, see past the kind of scripts and the ideologies we hide behind. So these sound like really simple things, but actually I think they're really important. Like we need to be attentive about how we talk about people, right? Like our kind of political culture right now is so on all sides, it's just so full of contempt. And so I think we have to be attentive to always humanizing the people that we're tempted to dehumanize, right?
As Jesus did.
Yeah. So paying attention to how we talk about people. And also just to be prepared to be welcoming to any seeker that comes in, even if you can't tell what sex they are, right? Like that shouldn't be the focus. The focus should be on meeting this person and connecting them with Christ. Because I think the ideas about gender, like when we're talking about evangelization and formation, you can't start with gender. You have to start with Christ. Like you have to start with kind of entering into a worldview where God is real, like that. Yep. I think about my own experience. Like if I had been this kind of progressive feminist, tentatively approaching Catholicism, and someone had come at me hard on the feminist questions, that would have probably driven me away, right? But instead, I was really formed first on, prayer, the sacraments, right? So foundational Christian theology, the life of discipleship. And then from that foundation, I was able to get to a place where I could hear, be open to the idea that I'd been really wrong about some things, that I held dear. And so I think that's kind of a general approach that I would start with.
I guess, and I don't know that you'll have an answer to this question, but I'm just intrigued by your personal story, and I am aware. I just was teaching a class, and I was trying to work out for myself. I had a sabbatical and was trying to work out for myself what it will look like to pastor a church in the next 5 to 10 years. And given cultural issues and political issues and whatever else. And I found myself going back, and I started the class. It was talking about culture, and trying to help people understand what is culture and what is Western Civ and where are we at and what's going on and all these things. And I said, I just want to share my priors, because if I'm wrong on any of these, then, let's have that conversation. And so I said, first of all, I come at this as a Christ follower. So I am shaped by a belief that I am a creature made by God and loved by him, not because I'm good, but because of his remarkable loving character. And then secondly, I said, out of that, I believe that there is such a thing as ultimate reality. There's truth. There's the standard, and it comes out of God's character, and there's right and wrong. And then I went on to eventually say things like, I think some cultures are better than other cultures in some things. And I realize those are fighting words, and it sounds very much like just a general power play. And I realized, I'm adjacent to that, but I do believe that there is ultimate reality. And so I tried to explain a little bit about the whole correspondence theory of reality. And it seems like you touch on that. You go back to that. That is say something about how you are just understanding what's really real, and that's an important, but it is a contested idea in the academy.
Yes. Yeah, it is a contested idea. Right. So, I mean, there is a standard of truth, right? So what I say or what I believe is true insofar as it corresponds to reality as it actually is, right? That's the kind of correspondence theory of truth, rather than a kind of constructionist idea of truth, which is what I was describing earlier. And I think young people are hungry for this too. Like, you mentioned the Latin mass rebels. And I think especially in our age of like artificial intelligence and social media, I mean, we're just surrounded by superficiality. And so I do think there's just something intrinsic to the human heart and mind that is hungry for truth and is hungry for what's real. And so I think starting with your priors, I think that's a really, like, attention to priors is really important. And one of those would be that correspondence view of truth and reality, which means that, yes, you can then talk about certain things as having more proximity to truth than others, more proximity to goodness than others, right?
Are you seeing, how long have you taught at Notre Dame?
I've been here for 3 years.
Oh, okay. So not long.
Yeah.
Talking with your colleagues maybe, or maybe your experience in the last 3 years, is there a vibe shift on campus among students?
Yeah. So I taught a course last fall called Catholicism and the Sexes, which was kind of an intellectual history, basically, of how we think about men and women, both in secular thought and then also in Christian theology. And I prepared the course thinking that, like, most of my students would have just average normie beliefs about these questions. But then when I went into teaching it, and granted, I'm sure there was like a self-selected group, but I just had really serious Catholic students in this group. So let's just take one example. Like on the day we talked about contraception, like I was prepared to kind of make the argument for the Catholic position with students who were pro-contraception. But instead, I actually had students who I had to defend the church's use of natural family planning against like views that you shouldn't use any kind of like birth regulation at all. So, and when we talked, I had to pivot. Like they were very interested in questions about headship, which was not something that I prepped in the course.
Right.
So it was really interesting to see that, among the kind of serious Christian students.
Right.
Yeah. They were interested in different things. Like they weren't wrestling with the idea of women priests.
Yep.
It was.
I got a call from a friend, and he pastors a large church, and he said, "Hey, I've got these married 19-year-olds showing up, and the women are wearing head coverings, and I've never in my life seen this. I have no idea what to do. I'm not used to students being on my right. They're always have been on my left." And I'm arguing, he goes, "Are you seeing this?" And I said, I see a little bit of it, and it is a new day, and I feel so old. As a general rule, I feel like I have been involved in higher ed, and so I always feel like I am the attacks or the challenges come from the left, and I'm always shocked when I'm getting attacked from the right. Like I turn that way and I go, really? Oh my goodness, I had no idea you were there.
Yep.
Okay, sounds like you've had that experience.
Yes, absolutely.
So I have one perhaps inane question. I have not seen this movie, What is a Woman, by Matt Walsh, but I am aware it's out there. Have you seen it? Do you know anything about it?
Yes, I have seen it.
And do you have an opinion on it? I mean,
yeah, I actually wrote a review of it for Church Life Journal, which is our institute's journal. I don't know, a couple of years ago now, maybe, but I mean, okay. Here's what I liked about it was a very incisive and effective critique of the intellectual incoherence of a lot of ideas of gender. So it very effectively dismantles those, and often in funny ways. So there's it can be funny, but I think there's something off in the spirit of it. It actually reminded me of, this is going way back now, of Bill Maher's Religulous. I don't know if you ever remember. Yeah. So, and that documentary, also very funny, was very much like, look at these dumb Christians who believe in God. Let's laugh at their expense. And there was something a little bit like that spirit in What is a Woman as well. Like let's have the most uncharitable edits possible of these interviewees and kind of look down our noses at these idiots, right? And so I think that there was something in there was a lack in the spirit of charity there.
Yep.
But it was also effective,
My experience is that the criticism from the left is condescending, and the criticism from the right is often mean. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of feel like I don't like either. Whichever I'm getting, I like the least at that time. But yeah, you want to look for loving, caring, thoughtful correction. Yeah. Okay, so I have my final 4 questions, and I'm just looking for relatively short answers to these. All right. Well, before I do that, let me just ask one question, just because I guess I'm looking for one. You write about the gift of the body. That obviously was a theme for John Paul II as well. What is that? What would you say to a 15-year-old, I guess, girl, or to a 25-year-old guy, or to a 60-year-old? What is the gift of the body, and what do I do with that? I mean, does that mean I need to take my vitamins or get more sleep, or I mean, what does it mean to say the body? We are embodied people, and it's a gift.
Well, I think the first part to emphasize is that the body is a good thing, right? I mean, there has been a strand in Christianity of devaluing the life of the body in relation to the spirit, but to really realize, if Christianity is so deeply incarnational and bodily,
there's a lot of Plato in there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's a human tendency. It's not just a Christian tendency. There's a human tendency to devalue the body because the body forces limits on us, right? So part of the body's giftedness is actually in its frailty and its limits, because when I get weak and sick and someone has to take care of me, that is an occasion for love, right? So yes, it's great when bodies are beautiful and strong and healthy. There's a joy in that kind of strong embodiment that we can embrace those parts of our bodily lives. But there's also a gift in bodily aging that's harder for us to accept, but it's more spiritually important for us to accept, I think. So, and the body is also a constant reminder that we're not God, right?
Right.
We are interdependent. We depend upon little plants to keep us alive, little animals to keep us alive. We depend upon air and water and other people. And so there's this pedagogy of the body that's always happening if we pay attention to it.
There's I'm drawing a blank on the name, but Kevin Kelly, who is a futurist, he started Wired magazine. He's a Christian futurist. I'm not sure how else to describe him. Tim Ferriss, who has a big podcast, describes Kelly as the most interesting man in the world. And Kelly wrote a graphic novel. He crowdsourced a graphic novel in which angels in heaven were frustrated with humans because angels don't have a body and humans had a body, but angels said they don't appreciate a body. They don't walk barefoot in the grass. They don't eat a mango and just marvel at what they've got. And so AI gets involved in entering robots in order for angels to have this embodied experience. I'm not a graphic novel guy, but anyway. Okay. Well, thank you so much for all this. I do want to ask these final 4 questions. Abigail, what, if anything, is keeping you up at night?
Being 9 months pregnant, that's keeping me up at night, and having to pee like 3 times. So I'm having a baby in 2 weeks. So I'm not sleeping great.
Yeah,
my body, the gift of my body is keeping me awake at night. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, we didn't talk much about women as life givers, but that's obviously a big part of God's design, and congratulations, and God bless you on number 5. What is on your nightstand? So I'm asking, what are you reading? What's your leisure reading, or what's your nighttime reading?
I have a big stack on there. So I love 20th century British women writers. So I've been going through an Iris Murdoch phase, and right now I'm just starting a Muriel Spark novel. So I've got a novel, then I have some Elizabeth Anscombe essays. She's a philosopher, British philosopher. What else do I have? I have like 5 books on there. It's kind of terrible. Those 2 for sure.
Academics, always books stacked everywhere. Okay, so what book or podcast or devotion or passage of scripture or Netflix show or Amazon purchase have you been recommending the most in the last 2 years? What is it that you are always find yourself just sort of giving to people, or saying, oh, you got to watch this, or you got to listen to this, or you got to do whatever?
Oh, man. What? That's a good question. You gave me too many options. Now I have like paralysis of the brain.
Okay, well, pick a book or a podcast or,
I really like the Christianity Today podcasts. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill was one from a couple years ago, but the Devil in the Deep Blue Sea is another one. So, they're doing interesting podcasts there. So, I've recommended those around.
Okay. Yeah. Final question. What are you working on now? Do you have a new, besides about to become a mom times 5, I'm not trying to shame you into doing anything besides that, but are you working on a book right now?
So I've just wrapped up a couple of projects. I actually wrote my first novel last year, so that's coming out this fall. And I also worked on a podcast series. It's a limited series, not an ongoing thing, that has a lot of interviews with Christians who experience dissonance with their gender. And that is, we're wrapping up the production phase now, and we're looking to release that in the fall. So those are kind of 2 big things I've been working on over the past 2 years that are
What's your novel about?
Landing. My novel is about, it's hard. I have to figure out how to talk about this. I've been confused. Like, how do I do interviews about a novel without spoilers? But, it's about a woman who goes to her small Idaho hometown after like 15 years. She's carrying a secret, so I can't reveal that. And she has some unsettling and ultimately transformative supernatural encounters while she's there. So it's kind of a spiritual thriller.
Okay. Okay, and that will be out when?
This fall, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations on getting those two done, and again on baby number 5. And thank you for your work, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory. It is a book out by Ignatius. Dr. Abigail Favale, thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you so much.